So my name is Jacky NeriArias. I'm the director of the Center for Cultural Liberation. It is a brand new department on campus, so you may have just started hearing about us this summer. But just a shout out, tomorrow we'll be having our big open house. So hopefully we'll be engaging in more conversations like today, and hopefully we can all share ideas and dialogue on how to be anti-racist. So today we are going to be presenting on the power of anti-racist language, and we're going to jump right into it since we lost a lot of time. And I'm going to, so Jada Coleman is is the graduate assistant for the Center for Cultural Liberation. She couldn't join us today. I know she's listening in, but she was not able to present in the end. But I will allow my co-presenter Shaina Warfield to introduce herself.
Okay, hello everyone. I am Shaina Warfield. I'm a graduate student in the School of Information Science, and I'm excited to be here with you guys.
Thank you, Shaina. So some of you may have heard about how the Scholar Strike or hashtag Scholar Strike started, but I did want to, again, just give us a brief history of sort of how it started. So Anthea Butler, an associate professor of religious studies and Africana studies at University of Pennsylvania, wanted to, on Instagram, she wrote that she really wanted to, I'm sorry, on Twitter, she wanted to sort of mimic the movement that the NBA and WNBA had done in order to sort of to raise awareness about injustices, right? When whether it was specifically regarding police brutality or just in general the injustices that Black people face all over the country. So a lot of scholars sort of were inspired by this movement, and the hashtag Scholar Strike for social justice started. And Dominican decided that we also wanted to participate in some way. So we came up with a series of different workshops, presentations, dialogues on how to actually become an anti-racist campus, right? So what Shaina, Jada, and I put together today is a dialogue. So we're gonna try to present to you for about 20 to 25 minutes. And then we have some dialogue questions. So we really hope that we can all engage. I know that we're a big group, so we're just gonna sort of do our best. All right, so I always start any type of dialogue and really any type of sort of difficult conversation, controversial conversation with community guidelines, because I do think it's important that we establish how we are going to engage with each other. I'm not going to read the screen off to you. You can all read it yourselves. But essentially, we want you all to be respectful to each other, right? Be open to each other's views, whether they're different, whether they're diverse views. And then as a disclaimer, Shaina and I are not here to be the language police or the diversity police, right? We are not linguists. So we're not here to sort of give you a list of words or phrases to say that make you an anti-racist. It's really about actions. It's about your intention. It's about you thinking about the impact that you're having on the populations that you're working with, whether it's students, whether it's faculty, staff, even your own families, your own circles of influence. So we hope that we can approach today's dialogue again with just a positive attitude and understand again that we're all going to make mistakes. My work is in diversity and inclusion, and I certainly still make mistakes.
Okay, great. So I will be reading to you from the foreword from an upcoming anthology for Indigenous poetry. When the light of the world was subdued, our song came through. And it was edited by our U.S. Poet Laureate, Joy Harjo. And hopefully this is a good introduction to how language evolves and the history of language impacts the way in which it does evolve for the identities that we want to uphold and uplift. So I'll begin here. We are more than 573 federally recognized indigenous tribal nations in the mainland United States. 231 are located in Alaska alone. The number doesn't include the indigenous peoples of Hawaii, the Kanaka Maoli, whose nation numbers over 500,000, and the indigenous peoples of Guam and America Samoa. We speak more than 150 indigenous languages. At contact with the European invaders, we were estimated at over 112 million. By 1650, we were fewer than 6 million. Today, we are 1/2 of 1% population of the United States. Imagine the African continent with 1/2 of 1% of indigenous Africans, and you might understand the immensity of the American Holocaust. There is no such thing as a Native American, nor is there a Native American language. We call ourselves Muskogee, Dene, or any of the other names of our tribal nations. In many cases, these names often translate as the people. Within our communities, we know each other as bird, wind, or panther, or by any other nomenclature determined by the particular tribal band, ceremonial ground, or family. Some of us grew up with the term American Indian, which came into use after the Italian explorer Christopher Columbus sailed into the region that came to be called the West Indies on his heavily financed trip to discover a shorter route for trade to India. America is a derivative of the name of the Italian explorer and cartographer Amerigo Vespucci. He proved that the West Indies and Brazil were not India, but what became known as the New World. Native American became ubiquitous in the 1990s, employed academics to replace American Indian. Only the youngest generations of natives have come to use that term, Native American. Native or indigenous or native nations are where we have settled in editing of this collection. Many nations have reclaimed or are reclaiming their original names. One of the first was the Papagao, who now use their original name, Tohono O'odham. Many tribes' names mean enemy in the language of their enemy. For example, Sioux is a French name adopted by the English that was derived from an Ojibwe name that meant little snakes. We editors do not want to arbitrate identity, though in such a project we are confronted with the task. We felt we should leave this question to Indigenous communities, and yet Indigenous communities are human communities, and ethics of identity are often compromised by civic and blood politics. The question, who is Native, has become more and more complex as culture lines and bloodlines have thinned and mixed in recent years. When individuals assert themselves as Native, when they are not culturally Indigenous, and if they do not understand their tribal nation's history or participate in their tribal nation's society, who benefits? Not the people or communities of the identity claim. It is hard to see it as anything other than an individual's capitalist claim, just another version of a colonial offense. And that Joy Harjo, When the Light of the World Was Subdued song came through.
Thank you, Shaina. Okay, so when we think about language and why this topic even matters, right? Why should we care that we are using appropriate language, proper language, language that is anti-racist? We really want to think about intent versus impact. So we've all heard the saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me. And what we know is that actually that's not true. Sort of course, physical violence has a a real visible impact, but the reality is that we know through a lot of through research, right? We know through psychological studies that sticks and stones or words are actually just as harmful as sticks and stones. They can really have some harmful effects on our physical and mental health. We know that microaggressions over time can have impacts on our blood pressure, on our chances of getting chronic illnesses like diabetes, and again, high blood pressure, heart disease. So it's not sort of as easy as saying, well, it's just a word or it's just a phrase. We really run the risk of activating stereotype threat with our students and even those folks that from marginalized backgrounds that we work with when we use terminology or words that that make it clear you don't belong here, right? So I think about the question that seems harmless, right? Where are you from? I get that question a lot, and I'll say Chicago, and people will say, well, where are you really from, right? Or what? I hear an accent. Where is that from? And while they may be asking, what is your ethnic background? You know, where do you come from? It sends a message that they believe I don't belong there, right? It sends a message that this is I'm different from the rest of the people that are in that space typically. So a lot of different thoughts, and you know, it can have a real consequence on how students feel about their university, about a classroom, about a professor, about a supervisor. So, and again, it impacts the climate that we are in, that we're working in, that we're being educated in. So we really do want to think about how is it that the language that we're using, regardless of the intent, what is the impact that it is having on the folks that are hearing this language. So here are some examples of some, you know, sort of the evolution of language. Language is not static. We all know that language in our own lifetime, right, has already changed a lot. Certain words have changed drastically. Some words have only changed by a letter. But it really does mean something to the folks that either have chosen to use that language or are receiving that language, right? Whether they're being labeled a particular phrase or word. So when you think about, for example, the phrase or the label Hispanic, right? Hispanic to denote a group of people that come from Latin America is very much a government term, right? It was designated by the U.S. government for U.S. Census purposes. But the reality is, most of the people that I know that, you know, that would be Hispanic, would be labeled a Hispanic, would not necessarily call themselves that. And that's for many different reasons. Again, the history and the context matters. So people in my family might not use the word Hispanic because they just identify as Mexican. That's been their, you know, their nationality is at the forefront of their identity. Most of the students that I work with and colleagues that are from Latin American background would probably say something like Latino or Latina or Latinx. And more recently, now we hear the word Latina. And you know, we see sort of the evolution of these different words, which all denote the same group of people. But again, the context really matters, and the history of how these words evolved matters, because it's not just that words are changing for the sake of changing, right? They're changing because we are learning as a society that perhaps we're reinforcing gender binaries. Perhaps we're reinforcing a group of people that are not in line with our history, right? I have no connection to Spain, therefore I do not consider myself Hispanic. And we see this also with ableist language, with pronoun usage. And now we're seeing it with teams changing their names, right? So Washington football team, my husband used to call it the Washington racial slurs because he just refused to call the team by a name that was racially insensitive, right? Now, there is a huge difference between using language or changing language because we as a group of people, we as a society have chosen that, you know, or decided that we want to call ourselves something different, or we are willing to sort of expand our definition of what certain terms mean, and thinking about a racist history of a word, right? So certain words over time have actually been used. The reason they're problematic is because they were used to denote a specific place in society for folks, right? Specifically roots in slavery, roots in segregation. So here are some examples of words and you know, sort of racial slurs that maybe at the time didn't feel like racist slurs to the people that were using them, but they certainly had that impact on the people that they were being used on, right? So they denoted a certain place in society that you had, whether you were a slave or an enslaved person, whether you were of a specific class, right? So they certainly also denote different social classes, economic classes. And we really want to think about, it's not solely about sort of a, whether something is problematic or offensive, because we all have a different threshold, a different standard for what might be funny, what might be racist, what might be problematic. But it's also about, considering the history of a particular term, considering whether we're culturally appropriating a term, right? So I've been in plenty of different situations where someone will say, introduce yourself, say your name, where you're from, and your spirit animal. And now we know that asking someone who is not of indigenous background to say that, sort of pick a spirit animal is actually cultural appropriation, and is quite insensitive, because that is a sacred tradition for particular people. So we don't say that just because, for the sake of introducing ourselves, or for the sake of, using something that has been used over time and didn't used to be considered racist, but now it is. And we also want to consider the context, right? So I gave you all these different examples. Again, for example, plantation wedding. For white people, thinking about plantation weddings might mean, this beautiful white building with, beautiful grass. While when you talk to Black Americans, the word plantation might, remind people of slavery, might remind people of segregation. So that is, it's again, the same word, the same phrase, but a completely different history and background. So I gave you just a couple of examples, but then I really want to emphasize these last 2 points. So a word or a phrase might not be obviously racist, but it has, again, the connotation of racism, right? So when you think about Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter, when someone says, I don't believe in Black Lives Matter because all lives matter. Of course, all lives matter, right? People who believe in Black Lives Matter are not automatically saying that other lives don't matter. But it has certainly become a contentious issue to sort of go against the idea that a particular group that is in trouble right now, right? A particular group that is facing racism, that is facing brutality right now, should matter a little bit less, because we just for the sake of contradicting, right? Because the reality is, if all lives matter, then of course Black lives matter as well. And then this whole Karen phenomenon. So I find this extremely interesting. I'm sure some of you have, or a lot of you have heard just through social media, TV, the idea of Karens are sort of a term that has been used to label white women who call police on Black people, whether it's men or women, who just for the sake of sort of, again, reminding Black people of their place in society, right? Reminding them that at any sort of, not even necessarily sign of danger, because it's usually not danger, it's usually just, you're minding your own business, and I really want to make sure people know that I'm a white woman and I could be in trouble because you're around me. So this whole Karen phenomenon has started, and a lot of people either named Karen or white women have decided that this is, using the word Karen is just as racist as calling Black people the N-word. And that is absolutely not the same thing, right? It is not equivalent to use those words. They have different contexts and a different history. But again, it is a problematic phrase that sort of demonstrates the idea of how language evolves, right? And who gets to choose what phrases or what words are going to be problematic. So with that, I'll pass it over to Shaina.
Okay, thank you. So how do we navigate conflict, especially when we set out to interrupt the racist language or racist behavior? We have to, at first, understand the helpful ways that we can impact any of these situations. Both these options here, calling out and calling in, are most likely very familiar to everyone. However, making sure they are used in the appropriate moment will help both you and the person in which you are dialoguing with to sort of navigate that situation in a healthy way. So calling out, option one, saying, well, I need you to stop right there, or no, I need you to redirect your thinking, that comment is okay, I'll need to leave if this behavior continues, saying any of those things to call out racist behavior is appropriate, of course, when words or actions are unacceptable or intolerable or they cause further harm. Another option we have is to call in. And calling in or asking or engaging a question such as, well, why do you think that way? Or what are your intentions? What are you assuming to be true about your statement? Or how did you come to that conclusion? All of these allow for conversation, allow for reflection, and move toward a solution together. And those opportunities will look appropriate when we're trying to seek information, seek understanding, learn, and together collaborate to make meaning of what is being said, what those intentions behind what we said are. So I have a resource that will later be linked from Seed the Way. It's a consultant company for educational equity. In this chart, we'll suggest more actionable ways to navigate between when it is appropriate to call out, when is it appropriate to call in, and give you some words and phrases, an example for how you may go about doing that. Okay, so now again, I'm going to read to you, this time from Citizen, an American Lyric, Claude Rankin's collection of poetry published in 2016. Hopefully, her thoughts, her experiences with navigating racist language and experiences that have caused her harm will open a dialogue for everyone to share about any anti-racist approach to language that they've had the opportunity to engage in. And I'll just read a few passages. This is the first section. When you are alone and too tired even to turn on any of your devices, you let yourself linger in a past stacked on your pillows. Usually, you are nestled under blankets and the house is empty. Sometimes the moon is missing, and beyond the windows, the low gray ceiling seems approachable. It's dark, it dims in degrees depending on density of clouds, and you fall back into that which is constructed as metaphor. The root is often associated. You smell good. You are 12, attending Philip and James School on White Plains Road, and the girl sitting in the seat behind asks you to lean to the right during exams. She can copy what's written. Sis Evelyn is in the habit of taping the 100s and the failing grades to the coat closet door. The girl is Catholic with waist-length brown hair. You can't remember her name. Mary, Catherine. You never really speak, except for the time she makes her request, and later when she tells you you smell good and you have features more like a white person. You assume she thinks she is thanking you for letting her cheat and feels better cheating from an almost white person. You are in the dark, in the bar, watching the black-tarred street swallowed by speed. He tells you his dean is making him hire a person of color when there are so many great writers out there. You think, maybe this is an experiment, you are being tested, or retroactively insulted, or you have done something that communicates this is an okay conversation to be having. Why do you feel comfortable saying this to me? You wish the light would turn red, or a police siren would go off so you could slam on the brakes, slam into the car ahead of you, fly forward so quick both your faces would suddenly be exposed to the wind. As usual, you drive straight through the wind, with the expected backing off of what was previously said. It is not only that confrontation is headache producing, it is also that you have a destination that doesn't include acting like this moment isn't inhabitable, hasn't happened before. And the before isn't part of the now, as the night darkens and the time shortens between where we are and where we are going. A woman you do not know wants to join you for lunch. You are visiting campus. In the cafe, you both order the Caesar salad. This overlap is not the beginning of anything because she immediately points out that she, her father, her grandfather, and you all attended the same college. She wanted her son to go there as well, but because of affirmative action or minority something, she's not sure what they're calling it these days, and weren't they supposed to get rid of it? Her son wasn't accepted. You are not sure if you are meant to apologize for this failure to your alma mater's legacy program. Instead, you ask where he ended up. The prestigious school she mentions doesn't seem to assuage her irritation. This exchange, in effect, ends your lunch. The salads arrive. That was Claudia Rankin from Citizen and American Lyric.
Thank you, Shaina.
So now we would like to open up the dialogue to anyone who's interested in sharing. So our first question here is, how has problematic language or problematic experiences influenced you, impacted your experience, or in any other space?
I've had that scenario happen to me that Jacqueline mentioned. At my old job, when I was a nanny, and the family right away, they were like, "Oh, your accent, it's not from here. Where are you from?" And you're right, it did feel, it was a little like out of, out of, I was a little like, I felt, I don't know how to say, like discombobulated maybe. It was just, I was like, oh, I was born here. I was born and raised, but my parents are Spanish speakers. It was a little bit surprising for me at least.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Adriana. I mean, that is definitely the message that is being sent, right? That you are different, you're not from here, so we must identify where you're from. Even when that particular piece of information is not really important, right? Like if that's not your job or has nothing to do with your ethnic background.
In one of my computer science classes, we were going over like two different types of hackers. One's called black hat, the other one's white hat. And the professor sort of like, I don't know if instinct was the right word for this, but kind of said, obviously black is bad and white is good. So we kind of like had to stop at that point, and I kind of spoke up and I was like, hey, that's probably something that you shouldn't be saying, that it's such an obvious change there, especially because there's nothing inherently saying which one is bad and which one is good other than color.
Right. Yeah, and we see that a lot with having things like a blacklist, right? What did it mean to blacklist certain people? And obviously, there's a connotation there that something is wrong with somebody who is on a blacklist because of, you know, some trait that we've identified. We can move on to question 2, which is, what does calling out a racist language look like for you, and what would calling in look like?
I have a response to that one. Specifically more the calling someone in. I find that the majority, this is outside work and friendships and relationships and different types of things, when folks may say something, I find that I really call people in a lot. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. I really like the calling in, especially because I think sometimes that whatever comments are coming out, it really is unconsciously done, right? They think that what they're saying might not be problematic or whatever the case is, but even just a simple question, why would you say something like that, right? Or what makes you think that way? How that language, how could you just said maybe make someone feel uncomfortable, or could that maybe hurt someone, right? I think just by saying one liner, getting them to really think twice about what they said can really be just a powerful moment. And I found that it's worked a lot, especially because the majority of the people, you know, they have a great relationship with you, right? So when they're being called out by someone that they trust, someone that they have a good relationship with, it becomes a little bit easier for them to be retrospective about themselves, right? And kind of take a step and go, you're right, my bad, you know? So I feel like the calling in is a really, really important thing that people can use, especially in the workplace as well.
Yeah, I think you made a really important point about trust, right? So calling in, with the whole phenomenon of calling in versus calling out doesn't really work unless you have trust. A person who's calling you, if you're the one that made, or I'll speak about myself, if I'm the person that made the mistake and someone calls me out, it will, the way that I perceive it will definitely be based on how much I trust that person, right? Do I trust that person to be honest about you know, sort of problematic phrases, or to have any type of education on anti-racist language, or are they doing it just to embarrass me, right? Which I think a lot of the time that becomes the issue, that people just feel embarrassed that somebody has called them out, right? It has certainly happened. I have certainly seen it happen. And then you just sort of retreat or become really defensive, and then the interaction doesn't really become about conflict resolution, but more about defending yourself. So I think that's really important, right? When you're thinking about calling in and calling out, it really is about building these relationships and trusting each other, whether it is professor to students, students to peers, you know, colleagues to colleagues.
I just want to echo what both of you said. I feel like the question of people becoming defensive, right, when they're being called in or called out is so important. And I guess, had an experience of calling someone in yesterday, and it was actually my partner, and he sent me this article about of some violent things that happened at a Black Lives Matter protest, and there were Black protesters who were, I don't know, I guess harassing these white people that were sitting in a restaurant. And he sent it to me, and he basically was like, his first instinct was to say, you know, I don't think this is right either. Like, I think both sides need to be acting peacefully, and both sides need to be respecting each other. And like, he was calling, you know, the concept of reverse racism just plain racism. And I was like, okay, pause. And so we kind of had a little calling in moment, and I was like, listen, like, and before I could even get my point across, he apologized. And he was like, you know, I didn't mean that, like, blah, blah. I'm like, no, like, you need to look at why that was your first reaction. Like, let's sit with that for a second. And it was really a difficult conversation to have because it was uncomfortable. And because we've had those conversations, you know, him being a white man and me being like a Latina woman, like, what does that look like? But I think because that is such a close relationship, it was so much easier to be like, I don't want this to be a fight. I don't want you to get defensive, but I need you to listen to what I'm saying. And so I think that calling in is so effective because it does allow to kind of break down that barrier that you put up when you're in a discussion with someone, I guess.
Yeah, and that's especially when the problematic language happens in your family, right? That's really tough because it's not as easy as just canceling someone. Right now we hear about cancel culture, and it's easy to cancel someone on the internet that you don't know, and you just, you know, don't follow them online anymore. You don't read what they write. But when you have a partner, when you have a parent, a sibling that you are dealing with on a daily basis, then you're still going to love. It's a lot harder to sort of call them in a way that feels like you're trying to teach rather than trying to condescend, right? All right. Any other responses to question 2 before we move on to question 3? Okay, so I have one more comment about question 2. So I do want to make this point as well, that we're not saying that it's always bad to call someone out. There are actual instances where calling out is the necessary thing to do, right? Making sure that that the way that we respond to an action or to a phrase that was used makes it clear to the public, to whoever is listening, whoever is watching, that that is not going to be acceptable, right? Or not going to be tolerated in this space. And I think that's especially important on a college campus, because we all have the power to set the tone for what is respectful, right? What are we going to tolerate on this campus? So while calling in is certainly a tool that that Shaina and I and Jada recommend, right? Because it is definitely hopefully going to lead to growth. It doesn't mean that calling out isn't going to be necessary at some point. Now, calling out doesn't have to be outright disrespectful or outright aggressive, right? But it is certainly can be. There are enough words and terms, and we all have enough history and context to know that certain words, certain terminologies are not to be used, right? Or are not to be used by certain people. So let's move on to question 3. How can we promote an anti-racist climate and in your own spheres of influence? And you could think about this on your sports team, in your classroom, in your household.
Dialogue, like let's say in a classroom, you're introducing a book that was written by someone who was, I don't know, a slave or something. Instead of introducing the author as what he was, kind of like use the literature that you're presenting, like this is a part of our art that we're embracing, and kind of like taking the spotlight away from what these colored people are writing. Like, I feel like when you're introducing something, you put the emphasis on that, and it's like, oh, is that why we're reading? But it's like, no, it's like contribution to the literature.
Yeah, that's very important. Recognizing that someone's marginalized identity doesn't have to be the main identity.
I think it also comes into play when you are setting boundaries with friends and family. And my family, I don't like any forms of hate speech at all. And I let them know that. And so around me, we don't use words like the hard R, retard, or stupid, or any other forms of hate speech. And I hold them accountable because at first they're like, oh, you know, you're just being over dramatic. I'm going to still say this. And I was like, no, I'm trying to promote an environment for my whole family to share rather than using a bunch of hate speech. So holding your friends accountable after you set those boundaries, and not excusing their behavior just because they're your friends and your family.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a good example. That actually made me think of a personal example of something that happened in my family earlier this summer. There's been at least probably 3 to 4 people in my family who have children recently, and they some of the questions that were asked, or some of the, you know, as family members were sharing pictures, people would say things like, oh, look at how light their eyes are, look at how light their skin is. And that, you know, that means something, because what you're actually saying is, even though you're not realizing how racist the comment might be, you're actually saying something about the standard of beauty based on the lightness of a child's skin, right? And that's very personal to me, because I'm married to a Black man, and my children will be obviously darker than I am. So having those tough conversations with parents about, you know, I don't want to hear comments about beauty based on race, right? That can be difficult, especially in Spanish-speaking families that may not have the same language that we have, you know, sort of in U.S. American academia. All right, one last example, maybe one last story before we close out? All right, well, thank you all so much for joining us. As we close out, Shaina, Jada, and I put together a list of resources that we use for today's presentation and that we just found interesting in general. Some of them are just lists of reading, articles, and then others are podcasts. So I hope that you all found today's conversation interesting, and I hope that, again, you will continue to engage in conversations on anti-racism throughout the rest of the year, not just yesterday and today. And please do follow the Center for Cultural Liberation's events, because again, we're gonna have lots of opportunities for dialogues across difference and just opportunities to learn more from each other. So again, thank you all for joining, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the presentations today.